Welcome aboard. This is the Admiral's Almanac, your leadership life connection, bringing leaders from all walks of life into yours so you can take charge, improve your leadership, and improve your life with the wit and wisdom of your host, Rear Admiral Gary Hall.
And thank you very much for that introduction. A little long, a little bit over the top, exactly as I wrote it. And good morning and welcome to the popular podcast, the Admiral's Almanac. I say popular because we rank in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. You can get more episodes wherever you get your podcast or go to www.admiralsalmanac.com where you can get other podcast episodes and learn more about our guest today. Our guest is Naval Aviator. He's a repeat guest on the Admiral's Almanac, a Navy captain. And by that I mean he's commanded ships at sea. He's a New York Times bestseller and author of fiction and nonfiction. He's a sought-after speaker at institutions across the nation to talk about writing in general, but most recently about fic-int, or fictional intelligence, or as some call it, useful fiction. Please welcome George Galdorisi, author of Fire and Ice. Good morning, George.
Hey, good morning, Gary, and thanks for having me, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I work at the Navy's Command and Control Warfare Center in San Diego, and I often give our technical vision briefing. And when our commanding officer introduces me, he usually says, now you're going to hear from a knuckle-dragging naval aviator on a closely supervised work release program. So appreciate the intro. It's a big step up for me.
Yeah, and now you had the opportunity. Well, I think you've been on before. We've talked about writing. Tell me about why leaders should write.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think, as you know all too well from your tours in Washington, our leaders are very busy people, and they don't often read point papers or those sorts of things, and they get PowerPoint briefings. But once the briefing's over, that information has a very short half-life. So we found, those of us who work in this in the writing world, that you need a story, and I think Michael Lewis, who's most famous for the book Moneyball, put it this way in his best-selling book, The Undoing Project: no one ever made a decision based on a number; they need a story. So for leaders, for emerging leaders, for mid-grade leaders, and even senior leaders, if they want to communicate something that has staying power, writing is the best way to do it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, somebody recently paid a compliment to me and said, boy, Gary tells the best stories. And so I've been a storyteller, but most of us in the military really aren't exposed to the importance of stories.
Yeah, no, and without putting too fine a point on it, Gary, I think it's even worse than that. Like I said, we live in a PowerPoint briefing world. As you know, people who provide PowerPoint briefings to senior leaders are often called the PowerPoint Rangers, because their briefings are, they have dwarfs throwing rose petals and dancing bears, and it moves from content to entertainment. But I think the other thing in the military, particularly in the world we grew up in as aviators, you live in a checklist world, and it's a left brain activity. And if we didn't do it right, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But you need A follows, goes to B, goes to C, and it's a very left brain linear thing. Whereas writing is a right brain activity. It's very holistic, as you know from your writing. So that takes some training to move to that side of your brain.
Right. And I think, some of the fascinating leaders I've served with had some sort of right brain activity, whether it was writing or music or art. And so I think being able to engage left brain and right brain gives you a better result, a better process in leading. So, but let's get people a little bit more familiar with you. You've had a fascinating career. Take us through it. And how did you make that transition from that checklist world in the shift into the writing world? Yeah,
well, I mean, there's an old saying: you make plans, but God laughs. I never thought about writing when I first put on a uniform, and then I had some commanding officers who said, no, if you want to be a professional, you need to write for professional magazines. So that's what I started doing. So I never had an epiphany where I said to myself, now I'm going to write it. It just happened really organically, writing articles for professional magazines. And then, I moved into nonfiction. When I was in graduate school, I took a course on the law of the sea, which is the biggest negotiating project that ever happened in the UN. And the U.S. signed it in 1982, but is yet to ratify it, even though over 150 nations have ratified it. So, I moved into fiction, and as my first literary agent told me, he said, write what you're passionate about. So I was really passionate about that, and eventually produced 2 nonfiction books on the subject.
So you started writing journal articles and to relate so that people listening don't go, okay, boomers. There's blogs out there and there's content creators. So I think our junior leaders, our emerging leaders, our midshipmen, cadets, and junior officers, just write about what you're seeing. Just write in a journal. Now, write with a pen and pencil or with your smartphone or tablet, but we'll get to that a little bit. But tell me how you had some sort of episode that took you from writing nonfiction into writing novel with one of your friends. Can you tell me that story? Yeah,
sure. And again, it's one of those unplanned things. So best friend in high school, played tennis with him back in New York at the Brooklyn Technical High School, which will probably tell you I'm a little bit of a geek, was and still is a very successful screenwriter. And, he would come down and visit us. He lived in Santa Monica, and bring his laptop and not to tell you way too much, but he was sitting there at our counter in our house, pounding the keys, and our kids at the time, I think they were in grade school, said, "Hey, Mr. Bill, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm writing a screenplay for a movie." And they said, "Well, can we be in it?" And he said, "Sure." So he put their names in it, and a couple of months later, the movie was on ABC, and they were like stoked. But anyway, he was visiting one time, and we're watching this absolutely wretched Steven Seagal movie. I hope no one listening is related to Steven, but it was all phonetics and no plot. So I said to Bill, "Hey, why don't you write a movie script that's better than this?" And he challenged me and said, "Well, why don't you write a novel?" And of course, I went. I write articles for professional magazines, and I write books on the law of the sea. And you know how it is when you've got a friend kind of poking you. I finally took the challenge. He held my hand a lot, to your points of having a mentor in writing, and kind of walked me through how to get that done. And again, threw it over the transom to a publisher, and Avon decided to publish my first novel.
Let's see. Do you have, is it 8 novels that you have in your library now, or how many have you written?
Yeah, I think 8's the right number. And, I've 30 years in the military and now working as a Navy civilian at the Navy's Command and Control Warfare Center. There's a pretty strong Venn diagram cross between my experience, active duty now as a Navy civilian, and the kind of fiction I write. All unclassified, of course, but it's not like I'm sitting there with a blank piece of paper saying, "Gee, what should I write about?" It's very military themed, high tech themed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's it's a really nice symbiotic relationship.
Tell us about the Tom Clancy Ops Center series of books, so we can understand what's going on there.
Yeah. So Dick Couch is a very, very accomplished writer. He's written all his life. He's the author of SEAL Team 1, which was probably the best book about SEALs in Vietnam. So Dick's always been a mentor. We kept in touch. And then, again, this is one of those, you don't plan it. So Dick did a book called The Sheriff of Ramadi, which was about experiences in Afghanistan with Navy SEALs and doing the things that we did in Afghanistan and Iraq. And an organization called Bandito Brothers, who's a production company in LA, thought they might want to option that book to do a movie. So Dick was in Coronado at a funeral for a SEAL that had passed away, and so was the Bandito brother editor. I don't know, this is a long story, but I'll try to shorten it up. And Dick was meeting with him for lunch, and he asked me if I wanted to join. I said, sure, I'm always up for lunch. So we met with producer and Mike McCoy, and he said, hey, we've just shot this movie. We're showing it to focus groups. You guys are former military. Would you come up to our place in LA and just look at it and see if this is something, if we're doing it right. So Dick and I journeyed up there to La Cienega Boulevard in Culver City. I had a little theater there, eight seats. We watched this movie called The Act of Valor, where the SEALs were the stars. And it was the most riveting 100 minutes of movie we've ever seen. After we watched it, we sat down with them. No big changes, but I asked the question. So I asked the question, well, who's doing the novelization of this movie, which means writing a novel after the movie is out? And they said no one. So we said, well, how would you like us to do it? One thing led to another. We went to our agent. We got that gig, wrote the novel, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 3 months, not because we were Tolstoy, but because of the movie, because of what SEALs are doing, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, the book was very successful. People who own the Tom Clancy franchise were interested in restarting the Op Center series. So because of the success of Act of Valor, our agent auditioned us to do that series. And then we did 4 books, 4 books in the Op Center series.
You also have a character that's threaded through 3 books, I believe. Is it the Rick Holden novels? Those are interesting. So you've kind of transitioned a little bit from the Op Center to the Rick Holden series, if I have that correct. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, exactly. We did 4 books for the Op Center series, and for a number of reasons, that was all we wanted, because we were putting out 1 book a year. And it's pretty fast moving thing. And we weren't completely exhausted, but we wanted to explore other opportunities. So started a series of books with a gent called Rick Holden. Did 3 books: Coronado Conspiracy, For Duty and Honor, and Fire and Ice. And again, getting the readers connected with that character and wanting the character to follow that character through multiple books.
I think you once said you write about things that worry you. So there's themes in each one of those books that worry you. And I think, can I say that it developed and focused your worry, because your last book, Fire and Ice, kind of goes into the fic-int, or fictional intelligence, or useful fiction genre. Am I correct in making that statement? Or
no, you're exactly right. And again, it's a combination of things I worry about and things that I know about. So the first book in the series, Coronado Conspiracy, I was in command of a Navy amphibious ship, USS Cleveland. We did drug operations in the Caribbean multiple times, and I learned a lot about drug cartels, and that mission got into the civil-military relationship. So the high concept for that book was, what if military officers are very dissatisfied with the president and they cause a military operation to fail, and the president's blamed, and he's going to get impeached. So now the Rick Holden and his partner have to stop that. So again, what I worry about and what I know. And then the second book, For Duty and Honor, I sprang from the time I spent as chief of staff for an aircraft carrier strike group in the Arabian Gulf. And I learned the enormous power of a carrier strike group commander, as well as the cat and mouse game that he had to play with adversaries such as Iran. And that formed the basis for that book, Duty and Honor. So, those sprang directly from my professional experience. And then, over the last 20 years, I think all of us have watched what's happening in Russia and watched what an autocratic leader, Vladimir Putin, does and can do and is doing, and particularly in Ukraine. So, it became something that I wanted to write about, and came up with a scenario that he was doing things that, and I wrote the book in 2020, long before the invasion of Ukraine, and it turned out that some of the things that I teed up as the high concept actually happened there. So it was a little bit prescient, mainly because of luck, just picking that topic.
I want to go back to For Duty and Honor, and not necessarily about the book, but there's something that occurred. You, I think, hold the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest time serving as chief of staff of a carrier strike group, and that's because of various situations. But now, during your time as the chief of staff, which is you're basically running the show for the Admiral and taking his input, and then you are the orchestra conductor, making sure all the ships, all the aircraft squadrons and everything work together to meet the goals of the battle group. Am I correct? Didn't the Admiral that was heading that strike group die in a crash?
No, you've got a great memory. The first flag officer and I served with in Comcordez Group 3, Cruiser Destroyer Group 3, which means it's a surface admiral. So you have a surface admiral and a aviator chief of staff, or the carrier group, we have a aviation admiral and a surface chief of staff. But yeah, our Admiral J. Prout was a very energetic and involved flag officer. And he flew with the squadrons just to understand what their aircraft, whether it was a helicopter or a F-18 or an E-2, whatever. And sadly, he was on a cross country, actually going back to St. Louis to learn about the updated F-18 Hornet, the Super Hornet. The pilot that was flying him got disoriented, and they crashed into a mountain and died instantly. So it was a very tragic thing for the group. Yeah, that was it's one of those things that's hard to get over.
The point I wanted to tease out of you is the aircraft, or the group, the strike group, had to continue operating with this tragic loss of a commanding officer and the flag officer, and you were the glue. So what were the challenges, the leadership challenges, that all of a sudden one day you're the chief of staff and the next thing you know, you're in charge of the whole darn thing. And so what leadership challenge did you face, and, how do you think it played out?
Yeah. Well, no, you're very, very kind to say that. So 2 days after we lost Admiral Prout, when we're, planning the memorial service and all those things, I got a call from Admiral Connie Lautenbacher, the 3rd Fleet Commander, who had stewardship over all the strike groups. And he asked me directly, he said, "Do I need to send a new admiral to you right now?" I said, "Admiral, I think we've got it. We've got a plan. We can execute the plan." And I was it for about 2 months before the Admiral Ed Moore left the job as commandant of the Navy Yard and came out to take over. So as far as challenges, I think number one, just helping the staff get over losing the Admiral, because Admiral Prout was a terrific leader. I mean, people loved him, had hosted parties at his home. He played golf with a lot of people on the staff. So that was number one, is just keeping the staff together. The second was the next senior officer on the staff, our ops officer, Jerry Ferguson, had orders. I asked Jerry if he would stay on a couple of months until Admiral Moore showed up, and he agreed. So that helped a lot. And then finally it was just continuing to work with the carrier CO, the CAG, the destroyer squadron commander, et cetera, et cetera. So the good news is, it wasn't as big a leadership challenge as I might have thought it would be. Everyone, just did their job. They were professionals and carried on. Right.
And so that just goes to show that an organization that is led strategically and operationally, and that has a detailed plan, that, good leadership means that the organization can continue on if the main leader steps aside or is absent, whether through travel or whatever. So obviously, there was a great plan in place and strong leadership that kept the organization moving. And I think that comes from personal and humble and balanced leaders. If you're a dictator and you disappear, things are going to fall apart. But I wanted to get that story out of you before we proceeded. Now, professional military, journals posed the question, how could anyone have predicted the invasion of Russia into Ukraine? And the answer was George Galdorisi did. So talk to us. Let's go a little bit more into Fire and Ice in useful fiction. And the genre of useful fiction, or fic-int, was big after World War II in that era, and then took a pause where people were no longer writing fictional pieces. I think during the Cold War there were some, you can even think that the different spy type of novels, made people think about the situation. But Fire and Ice, let's go into that. And how did you do it? And how did you have the foresight to think about Russia in Ukraine?
Thanks for that question. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, this Venn diagram cross between, my writing and my day job, I've got a little group at the Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific, where our job is to reach out to professional journals, think tank reports, other sources, and try to intuit what's going to happen in the future. And not that we have a crystal ball, but there are trends that you can see. And the reason we do that is because, our work is looking at innovating with new technology. So if you don't know what the world's going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, then, you don't know what technology to, it's impossible to look at the world at large and not follow what Vladimir Putin has been doing for the last 20 years. Very basis, Russia, as well as China, were not happy with how the world evolved after World War II. They felt that the U.S. and our allies dictated what the world would look like, didn't like it, and wanted that to change. And this goes back, in Russian history for centuries as far as wanting their place in the sun. So it's something I followed and said, well, what would happen if there was unrest in Russia, which is happening today due to their economic conditions and Putin being an autocrat? And what if he did what so many autocratic leaders do and tried to shift the public's attention away from their not so great circumstances to an outside threat? And what if he decided to invade one of those nations and also hold the rest of Europe hostage to his energy? And what if he used cyber attacks and committed acts of terrorism and genocide, et cetera, et cetera? So that was the kernel of what I was thinking about as far as a high concept for the Fire and Ice novel.
Yeah, many years ago, I had the idea, never put it down in paper, that the U.S. wanted, after the fall of the wall of the Soviet Union, that the United States missed having a symmetrical threat. And so therefore wanted to create, in this novel, would create a nuclear incident that would reestablish firmly the nuclear powers and the symmetrical threat. Anyway, you took your thoughts and experiences and put it into writing. So, you said there's some novels that are military thrillers that are reasonable, and those that are just absolutely crazy. Can you make a comment on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And that takes us back to useful fiction. And again, the tip of the hat to Peter Singer and August Cole, who have spoken in many places, the Air Force Academy, businesses, other military organizations, about useful fiction. And the first thing, it's not science fiction. To your point, it's not crazy stuff. As Ian Fleming once said about the James Bond series, things he tees up as scenarios may not be probable, but at least they're possible. So useful fiction, again, that Peter and August teed up, that your classmate Jim Stavridis teed up in his novel 2034. It is looking ahead as fic-int based on real intelligence, unclassified intelligence, and scenarios. So that's kind of where the useful fiction thing comes in, and that's sort of the impetus for what I wrote in Fire and Ice.
So if we've got young people out there that want to maybe write some useful fiction. And so how do they go about thinking the unthinkable, or what are your recommendations on how somebody might begin writing along the lines of useful fiction?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And if you don't mind, just to close the loop on this thing with Russia, and one of the things that inspired me to do this book, for some of the reasons I mentioned and others, if you study Russian history, the Russians are tremendous grudge holders, and they don't forget. So one thing I put in the back of Fire and Ice is a story that's been retold many times, and it goes like this: an angel appeared to three men, a Frenchman, an Italian, and a Russian, and he said, "The world's going to end tomorrow, and you'll be dead. So figure out what you want to do with your last night on Earth." And the Frenchman said, "I'm going to buy a case of the best champagne and spend the night with my mistress." And the Italian said, "I'm going to visit my mistress and then go home and have a great dinner of pasta with my family." And the Russian said, "I'm going to burn down my neighbor's barn." So you can see that just the angst and the anger in some Russians. But so how do people come up with these scenarios? And first of all, why would they do that? So going back to what we talked about earlier, it's easy to say, okay, who's looking ahead to what warfare will be 5, 10, 20 years from now? And for most of us in the military, particularly when we were junior officers, we said, oh, it's the people in the Pentagon. Well, Gary, you've worked in the Pentagon and you know what that's like. And for anybody who's not familiar with that, I'd suggest driving by the Pentagon south parking at 8 o'clock at night on a weekday, and you'll see thousands of cars there. So people are so busy doing their day jobs that no one has a chance to put their feet up on the desk and say, hey, what would happen in the future? So recently, people in the Pentagon and elsewhere in the military have welcomed, they didn't in the past, but now they do welcome this useful fiction, and people like Singer and Cole and Jim Stavridis and others to think out of the box and think about what warfare would be like in the future. So that's kind of where that stands. So, as far as particularly junior officers doing that, I really encourage junior officers in the military, young people in all walks of life, to think those thoughts, and without getting all zen about it. The Buddha had a phrase called beginner's mind. And what he meant by that was, once you're older, you're kind of set in your ways and you believe what you believe and are not that welcoming to new ideas. But when you're young, you have a beginner's mind. So I think young people in their 20s and 30s are probably more equipped to think out of the box than those of us a little longer in the tooth.
Absolutely. So my son takes great photographs, and somebody said, Gary, what camera do you use? And he replied with, you're a great singer. What microphone do you use? So what I'm getting at is, it's not tools that make you a good writer or a good singer or a good artist, but what are some of the techniques that you would have young people to start writing? In other words, they shouldn't sit down and go, okay, I'm going to write 350 words on a mystery, but what should they do? And I talk a little bit about putting pen to paper, in the fact that it stimulates brain, muscle movement, physical pen to paper, and it transmits your thoughts better than audio recording or writing on a tablet or a laptop. Do you have any tips or tricks on just getting somebody to start writing? Yeah, no.
So I think the first thing, as I alluded to earlier, is what my agent said: write what you're passionate about. In other words, if you picked up the New York Times book review section every Sunday, and in the back they have the books that are the bestsellers, and you said, oh, romance novels are hot, I'm going to write a romance novel. Well, if you're not passionate about that, you're probably going to write a pretty ordinary romance novel. So it's, write what you're passionate about, because you'll have that energy. It's like drinking a can of Red Bull. And then the other thing that, I've led a lot of writing seminars, particularly on the West Coast. And oh, by the way, I've put that information on my website, which we could talk about later, how people can pull that down. But I think it's a pretty big rock up a really steep hill if you sat down and said, I'm going to write the next biography on Benjamin Franklin, or I'm going to write the novel that's going to be a bestseller. And if you haven't written things before, that's really tough. So what I recommend to people is start out writing for a trade journal or for your college alumni newsletter or for a professional magazine and get some feedback. You'll have editors who help you become a better writer, et cetera, et cetera. And then, build up some, as you mentioned, Gary, some muscle memory that when you do undertake a larger work, you've, you're more fair in the channel. You're more ready to go.
Yes, I'm right now trying to read, or I am reading Ben-Hur, because during the Easter season, they always show that movie. And I wanted to read about the author, which is a tremendous story in the fact that the things he went through to research that. So one, yes, you're not going to write the great novel right out of the starting gate, because if you don't have the financial capability to do the research to travel like the author of Ben-Hur. So I commend that at least story to our listeners to go find out who wrote Ben-Hur and what he did to actually write the novel. And I think it was the second best-selling book in that era behind the Bible, and was only beat out when Gone with the Wind came out. Anyway, back to you. So you've got all these scenarios that, to start people to writing. Somebody once asked you, what scares you the most?
Just closing the thought, though, on your previous question, as far as, what people should try to do, or what they, if they want to write successfully, is, again, back to Ian Fleming. He said, the main ingredient for a successful novel is you have to turn the page. And that's your plot. People want to know what happens next, and they have to turn the page. And the other thing you need is characters who people want to be with. And in other words, if you wanted to write a military thriller about the war between the United States and China, it can't be just about the United States and China. It has to be about people, with a protagonist on the United States side and an antagonist on the China side. So, that's really the two ingredients for anyone who wants to embark on this. So what scares me the most is the full panoply of threats to the United States that we have to deal with. If you walk this back to after World War II, as you know, Europe was divided into Western and Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union had all their satellites, the Warsaw Pact, and all the U.S. military worried about was 350 Warsaw Pact divisions coming through the Fulda Gap and devouring Western Europe. And that was our focus, and everything else that we worried about was described as a lesser included subset. In other words, if we could take on the Soviets, then we could deal with what were called then brushfire wars. Well, as you mentioned earlier, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union imploded, and for 6-8 years, the United States was the unipower. And then our 9/11 happened. Our complete focus as a military was the global war on terrorism. That ended around 2015, and as then the late Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter pointed out, now it's much more nuanced. We have China, which is our biggest peer competitor. We have Russia, that's, as you see from Ukraine, is incredibly dangerous. We have Iran, and we have North Korea. So what scares me the most is, depending on what happens today or tomorrow, the U.S. can get a bit whipsawed about what threat we need to take on, put all our focus on that, and then maybe not be paying as much attention to another threat that might be creeping up.
Well, in those two, Russia and China, my two experiences were one, going to Moscow with General Joe Dunford. And when we met at the Duma, one of the politicians said, we will no more let Ukraine join NATO than the United States would allow Texas to secede from the Union. So that's what they think about the Ukraine. But I've gone to gun shows here in Texas only because it's fun to go to a gun show. And there's always petitioners outside the gun show wanting you to sign a petition to secede from Texas, to secede from the United States. And the other one was when I was captain of Tarawa, we hosted a Chinese ship that came into San Diego. And as we walked on the ship, all you could smell was fresh paint and your feet sticking to the dewy paint on the decks. And the toast from the Admiral that was on the Chinese ship said, here is a toast to the greatest Navy in the world, from the fastest growing Navy in the world. So you saw back in 2000 the aspirations of the Chinese Navy. So, well, between you and Jim Stavridis, Jim, I like your book. I like Fire and Ice maybe a little bit better. So that's Jim Stavridis is my classmate, and also my classmate was the pilot of that aircraft that Admiral Prout was in. So, George, as we wrap this up, I want you to give us a pitch on your seminars on writing, and tell us a little bit about that, what somebody can expect, and how can they have you set up a seminar on writing.
So I've done a number of seminars on writing. Some of them have been just one-time hour and a half, or 2-hour seminars. But I've done one in Coronado year over year for 4 years, actually. And as I mentioned earlier, I start out with, why write? Why would you want to write? And then how you would write an article for a professional journal, and then moving on to nonfiction, and then fiction, and then social media. So if someone were to Google my name, bring up my website, and there's a pull down there where you pull down services, and one would say one of the pull downs would be writing seminars. And again, it's not everything in the world I know about writing, but it's a lot of it. So if someone was interested in writing, they could just power through those slides, and I believe it would be useful to them as whether they're beginning, emerging, or accomplished writers. There's always tactics, techniques, and procedures, as we used to say in the Navy, to help people along the way.
Well, and that's a free resource, so you're being very generous with the knowledge you've gained over decades of writing, and so that will help stimulate people to start writing. And again, leaders need to write. And I want to thank George for his not only service in the Navy, but his service in defense industry, and his writing, which has influenced so many people and given us a lot to think about. George, you've been a mentor of mine in the past and in the present. And I want to share with the listeners that George Galdorisi once saved my life. I think I was in QB Point, and it was a late night flight. I got out of my aircraft on the flight line, and it was immediately jumped by 3 men who just beat me to within an inch of my life. And George Galdorisi came out of the darkness and said, "All right, boys, he's had enough. Let him up." So I want to thank you for that. I'm sorry. That's an old story, but thank you. So anything you wish to wrap up with, George?
Yeah, well, just going back to what I mentioned about the website, I've had some great mentoring along the way. I mentioned Dick Couch and others. And so, without getting all misty-eyed about it, one of the ways I'd like to pay it forward is doing the writing seminars. And that's why I put all that information on my website that people can pull down. And, happy to go one-on-one with individuals if they have any questions about writing. There's a way you can communicate with me via the website. And, if you say, "Hey, I've got a 120,000 word novel, would you proofread it for me?" I might be a little busy. But if you say, "Hey, I'm thinking of this as a high concept. Do you think this would work? Or do you have any advice?" Happy to pay it forward that way. And it gives me a lot of joy doing that.
All right. Great advice. And thank you for your support of my book, Navigating Leadership, Making a Pact with Excellence. Again, my first actually large concept of writing. If it's after May 15th, go on Amazon for Navigating Lead. My path from being a latchkey kid in Buffalo, New York to advising the president in the White House and having a great life along the way. And I also like to say it's a little bit of a love letter to my secret weapon and spouse of 45 plus years, Darlene. So again, George Galdorisi, author, writer, leader, you've made a difference in many people's lives. And I'll summarize with that any man can count the seeds in an apple, but only God knows the number of apples in a seed. And George, through your writing, through your leadership, you have planted countless seeds, which have produced millions of apples. And I'm one of them, and I fell out of the tree. So thank you very much, George.
All right. Thank you, Gary, for having me on the show.
And once again, thank you, George Galdorisi, for joining the Admiral's Almanac. Until we meet again, here's wishing you a happy voyage home. Remember, you can get the Admiral's Almanac wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify, or go to www.admiralsalmanac.com. Thank you.